To understand one of history's greatest betrayals, we must first understand the man himself. Judas Iscariot, one of Jesus Christ's closest 12 disciples, now the most hated name in all of human history. How did this man come to betray Jesus, the symbol of love and mercy? The answer to this question is not just the story of one man, but a dramatic journey that reveals the darkest side of human nature. Judas came from the town of Iscariot. Iscariot, part of his name, comes from there. While most of the other disciples were from Galilee, he was from Judea. This geographical difference may have contributed to his unique perspective. Judas was the one responsible for managing the group's finances. This responsibility highlighted his practical intelligence and reliability. However, it also exposed him to the temptations that came with handling money. Jesus' teachings had initially deeply impacted Judas as well. This young rabbi, who spoke of God's kingdom, uttered words with the power to change the world. He performed miracles, healed the sick, and even raised the dead. Like the other disciples, Judas took pride in being part of this movement. However, over time, his doubts about the practical implications of Jesus' teachings began to grow. Help the poor, love your enemies, turn the other cheek. These words sounded beautiful, but in Judas's eyes, they were not enough for the true liberation of the Jewish people under Roman occupation. He expected Jesus to be a political leader, to organize the people to rise up against Rome. However, Jesus kept talking about peace and love. Judas's disappointment reached its peak, especially after Jesus allowed Mary to wash his feet with expensive perfume. If this perfume had been sold, the money could have been given to the poor, Judas said. But the real reason was that he knew the value of the perfume and could not bear to see something so valuable wasted. This moment revealed his stinginess and attachment to material values. Jesus' increasing distance from the pursuit of a worldly kingdom was the last straw that broke Judas's patience. He had given up hope of the material and political benefits this movement would bring him. Moreover, Jesus' constant talk of death was worrying Judas. If Jesus died, the movement would disintegrate, and he would lose everything. Amid these conflicting emotions, a dark plan began to take shape in Judas's mind. Perhaps by handing Jesus over to the authorities, he could force him into action. Perhaps, when cornered, Jesus would reveal his true power and rise up against Rome. Or perhaps he simply wanted to escape this situation and claim his share of the spoils. These conflicting thoughts within Judas increasingly isolated him. The distance between him and the other disciples began to grow. While they found spiritual peace in listening to Jesus' words, Judas was constantly calculating practical outcomes. This situation left him outside the group and created the perfect environment for the seeds of betrayal to take root. The conflict that began in Judas's inner world was like a tumor that grew day by day. With each passing day, the gap between Jesus' teachings and his own expectations grew deeper. This gap was not only ideological, but also caused emotional and spiritual destruction. Jesus' words, "My kingdom is not of this world," rang in Judas's ears like a bell. This sentence shattered all his hopes. Judas had imagined that Jesus would ascend to David's throne, defeat Rome, and that he himself would hold an important position in this new kingdom. However, Jesus constantly spoke of a spiritual kingdom. This disappointment led Judas to steal small amounts of money from the treasury. At first, he saw this as his right. "Since I am in charge of the group's finances, it is only natural that I should receive compensation," he thought. However, over time, these small thefts troubled his conscience and diminished his respect for Jesus. In Judas's eyes, Jesus was becoming increasingly disappointing. In particular, Jesus' criticism of the Jewish religious leaders bothered Judas. Because Judas knew that these leaders were powerful and influential, Jesus' open defiance of them was a dangerous game. Judas sensed that this situation would end badly. Even though he saw Jesus' miracles, Judas now viewed them differently. If he is so powerful, why doesn't he use that power for political purposes? He asked himself. Jesus' use of his power solely to heal the sick seemed illogical to Judas. During conversations among the disciples, Judas spoke less and less. When Jesus' teachings were discussed, he listened silently, but did not share the growing doubts within him. This isolation pushed him further into dark thoughts. In Judas's mind, there was a constant battle between his loyalty to Jesus and his own interests. On the one hand, he knew that Jesus was truly a special person. The power in his words, the calmness and love in his behavior were undeniable. But on the other hand, he had lost hope in the material gains this movement would bring him. This inner conflict increasingly affected Judas's state of mind. He couldn't sleep at night and was constantly thinking. Jesus' frequent references to his death made Judas even more anxious. The question, if he dies, what will I do, gnawed at his mind. Judas's complex mental state increasingly isolated him. His bond with the other disciples weakened. While they drew strength from Jesus' words, Judas only experienced turmoil. This situation weakened his position within the group and made him feel even more excluded. Jesus' trust in him weighed heavily on Judas's conscience. Jesus had entrusted him with the money box. This trust made Judas's thoughts of betrayal even more painful. However, at the same time, he felt that this trust was binding him even more, and he was uncomfortable with it. Amidst these complex emotions, a dangerous idea began to form in Judas's mind. Perhaps by handing Jesus over to the authorities, he could force him to demonstrate his true power. Perhaps Jesus, cornered, would use his miraculous powers to escape, and this would make him even stronger. Or perhaps he simply wanted to escape this chaos and go his own way. The Passover holiday was approaching, and Jerusalem was filled with pilgrims as usual. Tension was high in the city. The Roman administration had taken precautions against possible riots during the holiday season. Jewish religious leaders were also uncomfortable with Jesus' growing popularity. This atmosphere created the perfect environment for the uncertainty within Judea to come to an end. Jesus' entry into Jerusalem was a turning point for Judea. The people welcomed Jesus as the Son of David and lined the road with palm branches. This image rekindled Judea's old hopes. This is it! Now he will take action, they thought. However, despite the crowd's enthusiasm, Jesus continued to maintain his calm and humble demeanor. His overturning of the money changers' tables in the temple both excited and worried Judas. Finally, Jesus was taking a strong stance. However, this action prompted the religious authorities to take harsher measures against Jesus. Judas sensed that this situation would end badly. The chief priests and religious scholars were looking for an opportunity to arrest Jesus. However, since a large part of the people supported Jesus, they did not dare to make an open arrest. At this point, the dark thought in Judas's mind became even clearer. Perhaps he could find a solution to this situation. That night, Judas was walking alone in the city. The dark streets of Jerusalem reflected his state of mind. His head was confused. His heart was racing. Jesus' constant talk of death in recent days was making Judas even more nervous. If he is really going to die, why should I go down with him? He thought. Judas's feet unknowingly led him to the house where the chief priests were gathered. He stood at the door, hesitating. If he went inside, there would be no turning back. But staying outside was now unbearable. His inner conflict was consuming him. Finally, he knocked on the door. When it opened, he stood before the high priests, his hands trembling. "I can hand Jesus over to you," he said. As those words left his mouth, it felt as though a piece of his soul had been torn away. There was no turning back now. The chief priests were surprised by this offer. The fact that one of Jesus' closest disciples had come with such an offer was an unexpected opportunity. They entered into negotiations with Judas. 30 pieces of silver, the price of a slave. Judas knew how small this sum was, but he could not back out now. As he took the money, Judas's hand trembled. These silver coins were not just money to him. They were also the price of his betrayal, the price of his conscience. As the coldness of the coins seeped into his palm, it felt as though his heart had frozen. "How will you recognize him?" the high priests asked. Judas replied, "The one I kiss is the one." These words revealed the most painful aspect of his betrayal. The kiss, which was once a sign of love, would now be a sign of betrayal. As he left the house, Judas's legs trembled. He was beginning to fully grasp the magnitude of what he had done, but it was too late. The deal had been made. The money had been taken. Now it was time to carry out the plan. That night, Judas could not sleep. The 30 pieces of silver in his pocket felt as if they were burning him. Jesus' face would not leave his mind, and the trust and love Jesus had shown him gnawed at his conscience. But it was too late. The wheels had already started turning. The next day, he tried to act normally around Jesus. But every word, every glance, only intensified the guilt within him. Jesus looked at him with his usual trust, spoke to him as usual. This trust made Judas's betrayal all the more painful. Preparations for the Passover meal had begun. Jesus had given Judas the same tasks he had given the other disciples. This normal behavior deepened the conflict within Judas. Jesus still trusted him and saw him as part of his family, but Judas knew that he could no longer live up to that trust. When evening came, the 12 disciples gathered with Jesus on the upper floor. The room was lit by candlelight, and there was a peaceful atmosphere. But for Judas, this peace was now torture. He sat at the table, listening to the others' conversation, but inside, he was experiencing a storm. As Jesus began the meal, there was an unusual seriousness on his face. It was as if he too sensed the approaching events. He took the bread, broke it, and poured the wine. Every movement was imbued with sacred meaning. Judas thought that these might be the last moments, and his conscience grew heavier. Then Jesus stood up and brought a basin of water. He began to wash the disciples' feet. This action surprised everyone, especially for Judas. It was a very painful moment. Jesus was washing his feet with the same love. This loving touch caused deep pain in Judas's heart. "One of you will betray me," Jesus said suddenly. These words completely changed the atmosphere at the table. The disciples looked at each other asking, "Is it me?" Judas's heart was beating so fast it felt like it would stop. Did Jesus' words mean he knew his plan? Judas asked with great courage, "Is it me, Rabbi?" Jesus' answer froze his heart. "You said it." These words were spoken in a way that only he could hear. Jesus knew everything, but he still did not reveal it. This behavior further intensified the conflict within Judas. Jesus dipped a piece of bread in wine and offered it to Judas. This gesture was a special sign of respect in Eastern culture. It was a privilege given to one's most beloved guest. However, in this situation, this gesture had a much deeper meaning. Jesus was showing his love even to the one who would betray him. As he took the piece of bread, Judas's hand trembled. This moment was a turning point for him. There was no turning back now. In the face of Jesus' love, the magnitude of his betrayal became even clearer. "Do what you must quickly," said Jesus. These words were not a command but a bitter acceptance. It was as if Jesus had resigned himself to the workings of fate. For Judas, these words were the final blow. He now had to act without hesitation. When Judas rose from the table, his legs were trembling. The other disciples wondered where he was going. Some thought Jesus had given him a task, but Jesus watched Judas leave with sad eyes. As he exited the door, Judas looked back one last time. Jesus' face looked peaceful in the candlelight. It was as if he had accepted the approaching pain. This image was so deeply engraved in Judas's memory that he would never forget it for the rest of his life. When he went outside, the night air hit his face. In the streets of Jerusalem, preparations for the festival were underway. People were happy and peaceful, but Judas felt as if he were in another world. The 30 pieces of silver in his pocket jingled with every step. As he made his way to the high priests, Judas kept looking back. He could still turn back, he could still cancel this plan, but his feet kept carrying him forward on the path of betrayal. He seemed to have lost his own will. The night was deep. Judas was walking toward the Garden of Gethsemane with soldiers and temple guards. Torches flickered in the dark night. Every step took him closer to a point of no return. The 30 pieces of silver in his pocket felt like they were burning him. The group moved forward in silence. The soldiers were ready with their spears and swords. The high priest's men had taken every precaution to prevent Jesus from escaping, but Judas knew that Jesus would not flee. He seemed to have accepted his fate. As they approached the Garden of Gethsemane, Judas's heart began to beat even faster. This garden was where Jesus often came to pray. The olive trees cast shadows in the moonlight. This peaceful-looking place would be the scene of the greatest betrayal in history that night. Judas knew where Jesus was. He always prayed in the same place, next to the large rock. He led the group in that direction. As the soldiers illuminated the area with their torches, Judas's hands trembled. From a distance, they saw Jesus' silhouette. He was kneeling on the ground praying. Peter, James, and John were sleeping beside him. This scene caused deep pain in Judas's heart. Jesus was suffering alone. Even his closest friends had left him alone. Judas walked in front of the group. Each step felt like a mountain. He saw that Jesus had noticed him. Jesus had stood up and was looking at him. There was no anger or fear in his eyes, only deep sorrow and understanding. "Greetings, Rabbi," said Judas. His voice trembled. As these words left his mouth, it was as if another piece of his soul had been torn away. Jesus approached him. His face still bore that loving expression. Judas leaned toward Jesus. The moment of the kiss had come. In Eastern culture, this gesture was a sign of love and respect, but now, this kiss would be a sign of betrayal. The moment Judas's lips touched Jesus' cheek, it was as if time had stopped. Jesus silently accepted the kiss, but the pain in his eyes pierced Judas's heart. "Friend, why have you come?" Jesus asked. These words tore Judas's conscience apart. Jesus still saw him as a friend. The soldiers surrounded Jesus. The sounds of spears and swords broke the silence of the night. Peter drew his sword and cut off Malchus's ear. But Jesus said, "Put your sword back in its sheath." These words showed that he continued to spread his message of love and peace until the very end. When the other disciples saw that Jesus had been arrested, they began to flee. As Judas watched them flee, he realized how alone he had become. He was no longer with Jesus or the other disciples. He was completely alone. Jesus was being led away by the soldiers, his hands bound. As Judas watched this scene, he began to fully grasp the magnitude of what he had done. Jesus' calm demeanor showed that he truly knew everything. Yet he did not seem angry with Judas. As Jesus was being led away, he looked at Judas one last time. This look was full of love. It was as if he was saying, "I understand you." This look left a deep wound in Judas's heart. Jesus continued to love him until the very end. As the soldiers took Jesus away, Judas was left there alone. The Garden of Gethsemane fell silent once more. But this silence was no longer peaceful. The scent of betrayal hung in the air. Judas looked at the 30 pieces of silver in his hand. They glistened in the moonlight, but they no longer seemed beautiful to him. They seemed like a curse. Each of these coins was driving a nail into his conscience. As he left the garden, Judas's feet felt heavy. There was no turning back. Jesus was being taken to trial, and he was the one responsible for this situation. The betrayal was complete, but the pain was just beginning. When morning came, Judas could not sleep. He wandered the streets of Jerusalem, trying to find out what had become of Jesus. The news he received weighed heavily on his heart. Jesus had been handed over to Pilate. The situation was much more serious than Judas had expected. At first, Judas had thought that Jesus would use his miraculous powers. Perhaps when he was arrested, angels would come and rescue him. Perhaps Jesus would reveal his true identity and rise up against Rome. However, the news he received indicated that Jesus had quietly accepted his trial. Jesus' failure to defend himself stunned Judas. Why wasn't he speaking? Why wasn't he performing miracles? Why wasn't he trying to escape? These questions confused Judas. It was as if Jesus wanted this outcome. During Pilate's trial, Judas watched from a distance. Jesus' calm demeanor weighed heavily on his heart. The crowd shouted, "Crucify him!" These cries rang in Judas's ears. The crowd's attitude was the opposite of what he had expected. When Judas heard that Jesus had been sentenced to death, his world collapsed. He had no doubts left. Jesus was truly going to die, and the reason for this was his betrayal. This truth burned so deeply in Judas's conscience that he could no longer bear it. The 30 pieces of silver had become a curse to him. He took them out of his pocket and held them in his palm. The cold touch of the metal froze his heart. These coins were the price of Jesus' blood. This thought drove Judas mad. He ran to the high priests. Out of breath, he said, "I have sinned. I have sold innocent blood." His eyes were filled with tears. His hands were trembling. But the high priest's response crushed him further. "What is that to us, you know?" This indifference shattered Judas's last hope. He threw the 30 pieces of silver to the ground and left the temple. The coins clattered against the marble floor. The sound echoed the scream in his heart. He ran through the streets of Jerusalem. He didn't know where he was going. His mind was confused. His heart was broken. Jesus' face would not leave his eyes. Those loving eyes, that final kiss, the words, "Friend, why did you come?" All of it kept swirling in his mind. When he reached the outskirts of the city, he saw a fig tree. Its branches were strong and sturdy. Judas made his decision in that moment. He could no longer live. This guilt had torn his conscience apart so badly that he could not bear it. As he climbed the tree, he thought of Jesus one last time. He remembered his love, his patience, his mercy. What was Jesus feeling now? Could he forgive him? These questions weighed heavily on Judas's heart. As the rope tightened around his neck, Judas's final thought was of Jesus. If only, he thought to himself, if only he could have understood Jesus's love, if only he could have been patient, if only he could have chosen love over money. Judas's death coincided with Jesus' crucifixion on the same day. Both of them gave their lives on that dreadful Friday. However, while Jesus died for the salvation of humanity, Judas was crushed under the weight of his own guilt. The high priests collected the 30 pieces of silver that Judas had thrown away. "This blood money cannot be placed in the temple treasury," they said. With that money, they bought a field where foreigners would be buried. That field came to be known as the Field of Blood. Judas' story went down in history as the most painful tale of betrayal. However, this story was not just a story of betrayal. It was also a cautionary tale showing the tragic end of indifference to love, impatience, and placing material values above spiritual values. Jesus' love had surrounded Judas until the very end. However, Judas could not comprehend this love. His own expectations, prejudices, and material desires had distanced him from the true treasure. In the end, he was left with only 30 pieces of silver and endless regret. Judas's silent cry continued to echo through the centuries as a warning to humanity. Indifference in the face of love, impatience in the face of patience, and suspicion in the face of trust, all of these could lead a person to Judas's fate. This story was a call for every person to confront the Judas within their own heart, for within each of us lies a tendency to abandon love, succumb to impatience, and prioritize material values over spiritual ones. Judas's tragedy was a painful reminder of where this dark side could lead. Finally, Judas's story was also a story of hope, for Jesus continued to love him until the very end. This love had not faded even in the face of the greatest betrayal. This was a sign that no matter how low a person may fall, they could be reborn through the power of love.